Today, we're going to be talking about essentially what a best-in-class sales planning process looks like at scale. And so we're gonna, I have three guests here who have a lot of experience in this area, and they're going to tell you and elaborate on, what it looks like in terms of how top enterprise organizations are approaching sales planning from a strategy to execution perspective. And so with that, I'd like to pass it over to my guests, Marina, Kira, and Melissa, to introduce themselves to the audience. And perhaps, Marina, we'll start with yourself.
Hi there. I'm Marina, sit in San Francisco and run sales strategy and planning for Atlassian. Prior to Atlassian, was at Stripe, and prior to that, Meta. See some names that I know, so excited to chat with you all today. I'll hand it over to Akira.
Hi everyone, my name is Akira Mamizuka. I am a VP of Go-to-Market Ops at LinkedIn. I've been with LinkedIn for the last 11 years, had multiple roles, both international, regional roles, and more recently, global roles. Very excited to spend this time with you all. I'll hand to Melissa.
Thanks, Akira. Melissa Fenner here. I'm joining you from the East Coast. So if any Brits are on the phone, you'll note my accent. Originally from across the pond over there. I currently work for DocuSign, and I'm our global head of sales planning and compensation. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today about this. It's very well timed as we start to look into the next fiscal.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. So, picking up on what Melissa said, I think it definitely is well timed. I know it feels like it's early in the year, but it's, already June, which means it's already summer, which means it's already fall, which is when a lot of companies start the process. But, maybe we can take a step back and set the stage for the conversation, and just talk about what does the sales planning process look like at a high level in terms of, who is involved, what are the objectives, and, starting times as well. And so perhaps, I can start with Marina from yourself and what does it look like from your perspective in terms of objective and involvement?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, I mean, I think first thing I will say is every planning process is a little bit of a snowflake or unicorn. But I think the most critical things are figuring out who are your stakeholders that you're optimizing around, largely starting with your executive team. So, CEO, CFO, CRO tend to be primary drivers of the process from kind of an executive stakeholder standpoint. And then, kind of really most of the time, what you're looking at coming out of planning with is one, a kind of clarified strategy heading into the year, two, a financial long-range plan, so top line and bottom line for, kind of a 3 to 5 year period, depending on the company you're talking about. And then three is all of your operational plans. So how are you actually going to hit those numbers? And sitting in, a sales seat, you're thinking about, kind of what are your bookings, ACV, consumption, revenue targets, be that as a MAID, depending on business model. It's your territory strategy. It is your quota territories, comp plans, but also things like your enablement plan. How are you actually going to get the field, kind of to understand what they're going into the year trying to accomplish? And so I would say that I think of a planning process is working a lot like an orchestra does, right? Where if you don't have every instrument, kind of in synchrony and playing their part, you're going to miss, kind of hitting that plan. And I think it's really critical to come out of the start of the year strong, especially, kind of with, a lot of businesses where, kind of linearity is such a critical, part of hitting your number. So I think of it as, kind of all of those stakeholders need to be in sync and kind of rowing in the same direction from day one.
Yeah, I would add as well, Marina, I think ownership is a really key thing to determine early into that planning process, so that not only are you rowing in the same direction, but the functions are aware of the components of planning that they're each going to be held accountable to and drive forwards. Because otherwise it can get very messy. Thinking about sales strategy, some folks in the field probably think they own that, but we all have sales strategy and ops teams. There's also a role for finance, and whoever owns the long range plan, that definitely will have a huge impact on the trajectory for the company and therefore the sales strategy. So that's just one example I can think of where really putting an owner against the components of planning is kind of simplify things and get you rowing in one direction. I think that's a learning I've had to have the hard way.
And I'll definitely plus one to what Marina and Melissa shared, and I will add something from the LinkedIn experience, which is um, realized that early on the process, actually, in fact, the first step on the planning process is to get our executives, our C-level on a room and align on company level, corporate level priorities. It's usually a list of 3 things that are trying to solve for next fiscal year. And then from that, we cascade and make it very clear to all teams, all planning teams, what we're solving for. And we feel that that investment upfront drives a lot of alignment and reduce cycles later on.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
No, go ahead, Marina.
I was just gonna say I love that point, Akira, and I will say one of the biggest recommendations I make to my teams are like align at the high level soon, like and align early and often. Because if you kind of are like, hey, we're pointed in the same direction, like we're all like, heading like from Los Angeles, north somewhere, you're like, okay, I don't know exactly where I'm going, but like we're at least roughly on the same page. And I've seen in some businesses dynamics where it's like, say you're doing only a bottom-up sales plan to hit a revenue number. If you don't know what your top-down target is, I've been in multiple places where you can do a whole bunch of really great granular work, but you don't have that stretch on top that maybe your finance leadership team is going to push for. And all of a sudden you've, kind of created a whole bunch of rework for the teams, and you've pushed your timeline to a place where you're really tight. So I think that point is definitely one that I would second.
In terms of that timeline comments, I guess maybe I'll ask a question to all of you, an open question. And I'm sure some people in the audience are wondering, okay, it's June right now. If I'm looking at the next fiscal year, when should I be starting my planning process? When should I be getting everyone aligned? Do my C-level people even know the numbers that they're going to be throwing out? Like, what are the obstacles at play here?
Yeah, I get a lot of raised eyebrows. I've had this question quite a bit because we actually kick our planning off in Q2. So Q2 begins in May for us. So the reason we do that, and I say start early, but have a purpose. You're not going to get many decisions made in Q2, but in terms of figuring out what's on the table, Q2 is actually a really nice period of the calendar to think about that because you're fresh out of what you've just deployed this fiscal. So the items that you weren't able to get done, we resegmented the book this year, but maybe we didn't quite get to the coverage ratios. That's now something that I know I still want on the table. I really wanted to accomplish it last fiscal, so now I'm going to make it a priority for next fiscal. Those are some of the conversations I start having in Q2. As well as at the highest level, are we driving an omni-channel strategy? Is that going to be a priority? The shift to digital, a lot of tech companies are going through that right now. Are we going to be focused mainly on the bottom line, or are we going to prioritize the top line? Are we in a high growth year next year? Some of those things are always consistent. We all want growth, for example. But I think at that level, you can align there so you don't have to rush those decisions as you get later into the planning cycle. Q3 becomes then about putting meat on the bones. What are the operational changes, or what are the things that I would need to do to execute on those priorities in the next fiscal? And Q4 is final sign off. So we actually do start quite early, but it's more about getting the purpose and the priorities on paper and aligned on in Q2, and then operationalizing and executing into the latter half of the year.
I can share how we do it on LinkedIn. LinkedIn, because we're part of Microsoft, we align with Microsoft's fiscal year, which starts in July 1st. So working backwards from that, around January, February, that's when our execs get together and they align on those top 3 priorities at the company level. Around March, receive first set of financial targets from Microsoft in terms of revenue growth and accountability margin. And from that, we start working together across all planning teams to come up with a plan. So we are in early June right now. I'd say probably 90% of the decisions in terms of headcount, where we're going to make our investments are already done. So the bulk of the action happens between April and May.
And sorry, Marina.
No, I was just going to round it out and say I think similar timeframes. Obviously, Atlassian operates on a July fiscal start. I've been in businesses that start in Jan, but I think similar timing as what Melissa and Akira have noted. I'll just kind of bring to life like one or two examples of why some degree of planning early is helpful. So, kind of there have been times when I have made metric changes that impact compensation plans. If you're doing that, and particularly if you have a global organization, you're likely going to have to go through workers' council in certain parts of the world. So you have a lot of legal constraints to when you can make changes, how you can make changes. And so as much as you can front run some of that stuff or front run things like shadow programs so that people understand how that new metric works, how they can inflect it sooner rather than later can be helpful. So again, you can't do everything at once. You won't know your revenue number upfront in a lot of cases because you are doing kind of quarterly reforecasting, but there are some things that if are there strategic bets you're making, you want to kind of plan upfront so that you have runway for all of the fields to really feel good about things when they launch formally.
Makes sense. So in the discussion so far, I think the three of you have talked about a lot of the different people that need to be part of the process, whether it be, at the C-suite level versus just other departments. And so I kind of want to focus a little bit on cross-functional collaboration in terms of, how do you, as, driving that sales plan, start to bring in all these different, essentially chefs in the kitchen, and how do you manage them throughout the year, because it can be quite a crowded space when you're talking about planning over a year.
I can share some of my experience here at LinkedIn, David. I believe the most complex aspect of the planning process is cross-functional collaboration, to the point that if you nail cross-functional collaboration, you nail planning. If you think about it, planning is a long set of decisions such as segmentation, headcount, bookings, program span, etc. Decisions that need to be made by also a long set of stakeholders, including sales, go-to-market ops, finance, marketing, and many more. So if you're to represent planning on a chart, will be a very complex matrix with a bunch of decisions on the rows and a bunch of functions on the columns. And to manage this complexity is really critical that each function have absolute clarity on the role they play in each decision. Otherwise, there's confusion, there's duplication of work and long decision times. At LinkedIn, we use the RAPID framework, which is really helpful to clarify the role that each function play in any decision. And RAPID stands for recommend, agree, perform, input, and decide. So every year, and we refresh the planning rapid and publish ahead of the planning cycle, so every function understands what's changing, what their role is in planning, and it's become such a core part of our planning process and even day-to-day decision-making process to use rapid that it actually has become a core part of our culture as well.
I love that, Akira. I'm going to steal that acronym. We follow something a little similar, but I think what I'll focus on in terms of how you get the most out of the cross-functional collaboration is there are tiers to your annual planning cycle in terms of how granular you're going to get, right? And what I try to do, even if it's early in the process, is continually reference those tiers. And what I mean by a tier is having a vision of 3 strategic principles for the next fiscal would be the top tier. There's a kind of middle, I mentioned putting meat on the bones. That middle might be things like operational changes, changes to metrics, as Marina mentioned, pretty robust transformational efforts. And then there's going to be things like change management or shaping individual priority programs as part of the operating plan for the next fiscal. So when we have our look back in Q2 about how planning went and what we want to focus on, it follows that structure. Are we clear on the vision? Do we think the vision is changing for next year? What are the operational transformations that are happening this year? What will that potentially lead to next year? How many of them carry into the next fiscal? How many of them will have a fast follow? And then are we already aware of the types of programs that we know that we are going to need to support where we're going to be next year per the 3-year plan? And I think even in our early planning conversations, having that lens applied allows us to start early but work with purpose and keep focus on what it is that we're each trying to accomplish. And it allows people to come in and out of the planning cycle based off of where they find themselves operating, whether it's at the top at that most strategic visionary level or more at an execution level around the specific programs that we want to prioritize. So that's just been something that's helped us stay aligned and get the right people in the room at the right time too, which is important.
Yeah, so I wanted to also ask, just based on the things that you guys have been talking about, we may have, or I may have skipped over something maybe key. I think some people in our audience are wondering in terms of, we're talking about this cross-functional collaboration, but where do these different groups like finance and RevOps and sales, where do they fall in kind of the key phases of a sales plan? So can any of you guys kind of walk me through? I know it always can differ depending on the different organizations, but if I was to say here are the building blocks to a sales plan cycle, what are they to each one of you?
Yeah, I can kick off and then Akira, Melissa definitely jump in because this obviously will vary by organization, but what I typically see is you often start off with kind of a strategic planning phase, a strategy setting phase that is coupled with kind of top line financial like financial go-gets or expectations. Some businesses give those out, some keep them a little closer to the vest, but at that part of the cycle, you're often, talking about go to market or sales strategy that is connecting the dots with your corporate strategy and your product strategy organizations. That then present up to, kind of an executive body, an executive team, in many cases, even the board on what is the strategy, right? To kind of Akira's point, what are the big bets for the year? That are inclusive of the commercial organization or the go-to-market organizations. Then I think, kind of once you have that, you get into what I would call like budget planning. So that is, kind of a deeper dive in what is the next year going to look like from a financial standpoint. You're going to do, kind of granular modeling of each product line. If you have multiple product lines, you're going to model at a regional level. You're going to model at your, sales segmentation level, right? So, kind of if you cover, say, an enterprise customer base and an SMB customer base, kind of you'll look at those differently. That tends to be, again, a joint exercise between finance and our RevOps kind of function. And really is getting you to, kind of a more granular, quasi bottoms up against that top down, kind of like LRP level go get that you may have coming in the door. There is some blurring, I will say, between all of these phases because they are very iterative of, kind of if you're massively off from a go get, as an example, you may say, actually, I have to go back and revise my strategy because it is untenable to the CFO, the board, kind of our shareholders to not hit X number. And if you're telling me that I can't hit, the number that your bottom up plan doesn't get you to the number with that strategy, with that set of priorities, you may need to iterate, right? But kind of I generally see you have kind of that strategy and top down, kind of expectations phase. Then you have a budgeting phase. You're also doing granular headcount planning during that time, right? So, kind of the way I've, kind of seen this done is with capacity plans and ratio-based modeling for kind of account team roles. So think, if I know that I have to have X sellers or account associates in the business, how many sales engineers, kind of, or solution architects do I need mapped to those folks to bring in business? How many, kind of sales development representatives or, some form of, like demand gen, EDR, SDR, whatever you want to call that, do I need mapped to those? So you're kind of in parallel building up your revenue or bookings or as well as your headcount plan. So that's phase two for me. Phase three is what I'll call operational planning, which is how do you actually translate that into something that the field can go and execute against, right? So, you probably by that phase, you have a high level segmentation, you have some strategic bets you're making. And so then you're starting to go and ask questions like, how am I going to carve, territories that are optimized, right, to hit our objectives? Kind of where am I? And it's like, when am I hiring the humans? And like, I'm going to get a hiring plan in place. I'm going to, figure out what that means in terms of territories that have interim coverage versus have, kind of fully staffed, from day one. I'm going to figure out where my targets are going, kind of down to that territory level, rep level. I'm going to map all of my cross-functional teams into those account teams. I'm going to finalize comp plans. I'm going to start some enablement. And that, for me runs not actually even just to the start of the fiscal year. I don't think I've ever been in a business where we've fully launched plan until more like sales kickoff. So, kind of a few weeks after the formal start of the fiscal year. So don't feel maybe I would tell myself because I feel this way, but I've never been in a business where actually the plan launches day one. You launch portions of the plan day one, but often some pieces trail in kind of the first few weeks.
Great. Is that aligned? Yeah, Kira, your experience kind of similar
Very similar to
buckets?
how Marina described. I will add a couple of nuances at LinkedIn. So on that first step on defining what's going to be the strategic plan for next fiscal year, that's where we start as well. And it's largely there's a product strategy component. So are we launching new products or new features next year, and what's the implications to our resourcing plan, to our bookings plan? And the other component of the strategy is the go-to-market strategy. Are we making important go-to-market changes, such as a segmentation change, for example? So that's essentially how we determine our strategy for next fiscal year. And based on that, we start to build our headcount plans, our bookings plan, and receive sort of targets from the finance team, both in terms of revenue and expenses. And based on those targets, we start to iterate that plan, headcount and bookings, to make sure we're hitting our targets. And to do so, we might have to move resources from one side to the other to stay within our revenue and expense envelope. So it's a very iterative process. I'd say the functions that are the center is go-to-market ops, probably the hub of the wheel, working very closely with finance, with product, with the enablement and other teams.
Yeah, I want to ask a question just came in through the Q&A section in terms of the ROI cycle for plans and programs. And I think it directly relates to what we're talking about right now, because even if we think about these different phases and also when we start during the year. So the question is really, what are your thoughts on the ROI cycle in terms of, how long do you wait until evaluating, hey, I've introduced this thing into the plan for X, Y, and Z reasons, but now I want to figure out, is it actually working? How long do I wait? And because that has direct implications on the next year's cycle, right? And Melissa, I don't know if you have direct thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll offer up a quick example. We actually last year were moving from a monthly recurring revenue to an annual contract value number. So we were switching all of our metrics over, and we ran actually a couple of pilots to shadow report to figure out how we would pay on a new metric. The level of effort to convert all those dashboards. It's quite a lot of moving pieces. And a framework we used there was this concept of a pre-mortem and a post-mortem. And I think you can take that into the next year. So a pre-mortem is saying, what metrics am I going to use to make the decision against? And what goal for each of those metrics am I going to reach for it to be considered a go decision? And if I miss it, it's considered a no-go. you can end up being a little bit more flexible, but it gives you that structure before you're even in the pilot or before you're even enacting the change. So one thing I do is we've done about 50 different comp plans. All of our comp plans change because of that metric change. And I'm just going into our quarterly business review for compensation this evening, in fact. And we determined that we were going to use distribution. We gave ourselves a benchmark of 80% of the population being ahead of 80% attainment. So that was our pre-mortem decisioning point. That now becomes a slide that I will come back to every quarter to say, is it working? Is that the yardstick I'm hitting? And if not, why? And now that's the conversation that I have with my leadership team. So I really like that pre-mortem, post-mortem split. It allows you to kind of check in and start monitoring the impact of your changes very early on, actually. And then you can continue to do that and tweak as you go through this fiscal, which allows you to then better design for the next fiscal.
The other thing I would add that I've seen done really well for major changes is figure out whether you have a test or pilot population that you can run, kind of subscale before you run with the broader organization. So this is maybe less a kind of core planning activity, but we recently implemented some forecasting changes, and we started with, our strategic segment of accounts, right? Because it is a relatively smaller population of sellers, with, in many ways, some of the more complex requirements, could see how it worked and then scale it elsewhere. So I'm a big believer in figuring out if you do have a little bit of luxury of time. I think that test and scale motion can be really helpful too.
And I know that the example in the question was about launching a new metric. In my experience, new metrics are relatively straightforward. But the question is really good in terms of, how long it takes and when you decide to stop or kill something. To me, that's like a mistake that often companies make. They continue to invest and focus on projects that should have be stopped or killed right away. And what I see a lot is companies actually think they're not going well. Companies put even more resources and focus and start to snowball. And that's where I think senior leaders should lean into, acknowledge and own that thing is not working and stop it. So I don't think there's a specific timeline. There are things that within a quarter, it's working or not working, things that take a year. But I think my point is often requires senior leaders to step in to stop something, because the natural tendency in organizations that people will want to make it work and put more resources to make it work, versus when sometimes the right thing is just to kill it.
Yeah, no, those are great responses. I wanted to ask a little bit. So I heard the terms pilot and test and control. How do you guys decide how to roll things like that out in terms of, are you doing it regionally? Are you doing it by team? Is there any concerns in terms of fairness across the sales force of, hey, these guys are getting measured on these metrics. I think they're getting paid huge because of that. I'm not getting a share of this. Have you run into any of that in these circumstances?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick anecdote here. So part of that metric transformation, we ran 2 pilots. I think how we determined those pilots were, we wanted basically statistical significance. So what you need for that is a fairly diverse pool of folks to monitor things against. So when it came to me selecting a region, we went for a region that had the most types of customers by vertical. We didn't want to focus on fins or HLS and have an industry impact. Equally, we had to get a global view. So we did run things globally. So I think diversification of your population in the pilot is the #1 rule. The second thing, though, is I have always provided equal propensity to earn, which is different to equal earnings. But I will give them full transparency into how they make as much money, if not more money, in this pilot compared to the control group, which is what's on, maybe on a different compensation plan in this example, at least. And that, again, it's not the same as saying I'm going to true you up, because that's going to drive a behavior in and of itself. But you can say, I have designed your plan to work in one of three ways to maximize earnings. The way their plan works is one of three ways that are completely different, and that maximizes earnings. And then you're asking them to change their behaviors very transparently and giving them equal propensity to earn as the other pilots. And then looking back, if there's anyone that really missed out, that is a conversation you can have as a one-off and as an exception. We're always open to them because compensation in particular is a very emotional topic. We understand how important money is to everyone. So exceptions are always appreciated and acknowledged and worked on. But I think those two rules are really important: diversification and then equal propensity to earn are two things we always try to consistently do when building our pilots.
And I love, Melissa, what you're saying, because I'll go back to kind of some of, I think what I mentioned before, but I think if you are veering away from equal propensity, you start getting into, especially in other countries, workers' council type dynamics, and you want to be really cognizant of like, what is my on-target earnings for this population, and what is my target distribution from like an HR comp standpoint. I think if you're looking at that and you're saying, hey, a shift in measure is going to materially change that distribution in the on-target earnings, I think you do need to look at, kind of revisiting how you're going to roll out those changes or thinking about plan design slightly differently, because you can get yourself into, weird places if you do that. And then I would also say that, kind of as businesses kind of scale, I think it is important to say, hey, actually different populations of, even sellers, right? It's like you may have the title AE, but it's very reasonable to have different plans, say for a seller that's selling to, kind of a mid-market-y type profile versus, a global account, it's like a global account manager, GAM type model. They should be paid differently in a lot of ways. Those are deeply different roles. And so I would, worked at an organization that had 50 comp plans for different sales profiles. That's obviously way too many. Got it down to maybe 10 or, 10 or 12. But so I'm not saying you want 50, but I think that, one for every seller in a large enterprise organization is also probably not realistic in terms of, kind of the right balance between simplicity and appropriateness for the role.
And plus one to what they shared, I will bring one recent example here at LinkedIn that speaks to the sort of downside protection when you roll out something to a few teams that could create some risk to their year. So next year, we're doing a pilot in one of our segments to better understand cause and effect between account loads and outcomes like revenue growth on a per account basis. So for that segment, we are actually defining different levels of account loads by team. So some teams will have account loads that will be 20% higher than average and others 20% lower than average. And we're still going to assign the same growth expectation on a per account basis for all of those teams. So we know that some teams, part of the pilot, the ones who have higher account loads might underperform. And we communicated them that if that's the case, we're going to give them a quarter relief. But we always make sure that we make clear to the sales team that innovation is at the DNA of the tech companies, both product innovation and go-to-market innovation. So being able to do pilots and also have instruments to manage downside when it happens, is part of what we do in this part of business.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent detail. I think I wanted to also kind of shift on that theme of equal propensity to earn, because I think that's a great term. That requires a ton of trust, right? In terms of if I'm looking at it from the sales perspective. And so obviously building that trust requires a very strong data foundation. So I wanted to maybe shift the conversation a little bit in terms of, all the things we're talking about require data. We're talking about goal setting, we're talking about forecasting, designing our territories. In all of this, how are you making these decisions, and how are you, building up your data pipeline to essentially say, I'm making these decisions on a very solid basis, trust me, everyone in the organization, essentially. how's it done in your experience to build that foundation?
I mean, Akira, go ahead.
Cool, thank you. I can share an experience here at LinkedIn. It was a very humbling experience on the data foundation space. It was about when we migrated CRMs a couple years ago. And I usually say that in planning, quality data is like oxygen because data fuels every single planning decision. And like oxygen, we take quality data for granted and we only realize it's a privilege when we miss it. So a few years back, LinkedIn, and we went through the CRM migration journey. Before the migration, we had real-time data available at the click of a button with reports that were shared by all teams, metrics that were well understood and aligned until we started this migration process. So for whoever went through a CRM migration, it doesn't happen overnight. There's a long period of time when data from some customers is sitting in the new CRM and the rest is still in the old CRM waiting to be migrated. And to solve for this, we built an offline data infrastructure to consolidate data from both CRMs. And when we launched this infrastructure, we suffered from high latency in the data, low freshness, and low accuracy, which impacted not only the planning process, but also how we run the business, including forecasting. So we had to raise a code red with LinkedIn engineering, which is the highest level of urgency, to up-level the infrastructure, which took many months. And fast forward, we set SLAs for the data set. We created on-call support. Today, it's in version 6. All teams report from it. Latency went down from 36 hours to 4 hours. But more importantly, to David's question, we defined this data set as a source of truth for all go-to-market data. So all go-to-market teams, including sales, they are reporting from this data set, and all data and metric is aligned across the board.
I'll build on that. I think, the tooling is really important. But for us, we were maybe in a different level of maturity. And the best tooling in the world wasn't going to solve our level of misalignment. And we actually really had to focus on standardizing our understanding of the metrics first and foremost. And we've really learned to over communicate on what the sources of our data are, what are the assumptions. An example might be, if you think about a renewal with growth, if you have an auto renewal process that will always add X% to a renewal with growth might be any renewal with X% or more on, or it might be any renewal that's greater than being a flat renewal, meaning being zero, net zero impact, just a flat renewal. Well, as you might put 1% on that and consider it a renewal with growth. But if you're using our internal viewpoint, then a renewal with growth is actually a renewal with 3 percentage points of growth on top of it. So that's a definition we have internally that is not intuitive necessarily. And you have to really align on those definitions. Or equally, another example we had recently is we've released a new product. Our intelligent agreement management is a platform product, and we want to know how many of our reps are selling it. Well, do I want to consider just any rep in seat, or do I want to consider a fully ramped FTE that's been here long enough to know the product and to know the sales cycle and how to go to market? What's a fair metric? So those decisions up front, I think, are fundamental to having any way of really being able to use data in a meaningful way to drive decisions. And it doesn't matter what tool you have in place or what process is, unless you have alignment on what the data actually means and what those metrics actually are.
Interesting. And then Marina, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that data is it's probably one of the biggest challenge points of maintaining, as Akira said, that really healthy cross-functional collaboration, right? Because if you're spending cycles talking past each other using different data or metrics, you've really lost time that could have been spent on kind of more strategic or moving forward conversations. But I will say it is a really, really hard problem to solve because different parts of the business have real reasons for wanting to look differently at metrics. You know, as an example, I think, you know, kind of I saw this dropped into chat by someone, but MRR, you know, kind of in a product-led organization makes a ton of sense if you're trying to see, you know, kind of how is a self-serve product gaining really quick velocity and momentum. But if you're talking about that for your enterprise business, you're really, you know, kind of missing the story on how, you know, kind of how revenue is coming into the business. And so I think stuff like that, if you don't have those intentional conversations, as Melissa has said, around what metric you're using to make what decision, you can lose a lot of time. And then just there's a lot of, I think most technology organizations have a lot more like data debt than I think ideally you would see. You know, I've been in organizations that are using Google Sheets for you know, things that really should be you know, automated tools, you know, kind of creating these pipelines that, you know, don't always refresh on the same cadence. And so you get yourself into like real trouble with making sure that the data you have is accurate, up to date, reflective of like consistent customer hierarchies. And that can be many people's full-time jobs to make sure that that is right during planning, but also beyond.
There's been a couple questions that have come through the chat that are actually very timely as they relate to the next two topics that we want to discuss. So I think I'm going to jump to you know, the next phase of the discussion. I wanted to focus on common breakdowns and failure points and your experience of, you know, how do organizations get this wrong? And you know, because again, it's a very long process. I think that if you get it wrong, there is a lot of debt to recover from. And so yeah, I just wanted to ask in terms of your experience, like what are the key failure points? I think Akira, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that cross collaboration. You know, if you fail that, the whole thing is failed. But what are some other points that people should be careful of?
I will say one pain point I've seen in planning cycles is trying to fix problems that should be run the business run rate problems in the planning cycle. And so, you know, an example of this could be some of that data hygiene stuff, right? Which is it's like if you've come up on planning and you haven't done the work that you should have done on, you know, kind of process, you know, kind of optimizations, canonical data sources, et cetera, you're going to run into real issues. But that's not exclusive to um, data dynamics. It's also things like strategy conversations. Like if you haven't sat down with R&D to say, hey, we need you to ship X, Y, Z in order to hit, you know, kind of to be able to penetrate this part of the market. If you're having that conversation in the planning cycle, then you're like, well, you're not going to ship in time for me to have a meaningful dent in year, you know, kind of ACV bookings, et cetera. You know, kind of if I'm just assume a 9-month sales cycle, assume, you know, kind of a 6-month cycle, whatever, right? So I do think that a mistake is to use planning as like the moment for interlock with cross-functional teams. Not the right way to do it. It needs to be always on, and planning is a very specific mode of collaboration, not the only way of collaborating with those teams.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Marina, especially around like the run the business stuff. Last year, I started to think about, it's not my kind of framework. A mentor of mine gave this to me, but maybe it's helpful for others here, is that, you know, you have strategic friction and tactical friction in an organization. And tactical friction is what you want to remove. Those are like all of the inefficiencies, all those run the business problems. And strategic friction is a way for you to prioritize what you want to fix. And if you take those two different perspectives and prioritize what is causing the most strategic friction, that might be friction in you achieving your growth goal, friction in the engagement model, an inability to cover all territories. That allows you to prioritize then what you want to solve in planning. And to your point, you can't solve everything at once. So prioritizing is also critical. And you can't make everyone happy in planning. So really homing in on what are the top 2, 3 goals we want to achieve this year. The rest is for a later day. And we're always going to be continuously improving, and we'll get around to it then.
I love this concept of the tactical and strategic friction. I'll share one example of a breakdown that happened at LinkedIn in the past at a time when we were hiring 300-400 sales reps a year net new. And this goes back to silos and working cross-functionally. So LinkedIn was hiring 300-400 people a year. And by the time those decisions were made, we realized that the talent acquisition team, they were not staffed enough to deliver all those hires by the time they had to be in seat. TA was saying, hey, I can hire 400 people within 12 months, but not within 3 months. And that created a gap on our plan. And the business started the year with dozens of open seats. And to solve for this, we created a talent acquisition planning work stream to share with our hiring team or recruiting team early hiring scenarios so they could plan appropriately, staff their team, be able to commit to realistic hiring goals to ensure we had a strong start of the year.
A question just came in that I think is really important because I know that I've experienced in my past, and I'm sure you guys have as well. But what happens when there is a major shift in strategy? Could be coming from obviously any level, but let's say you're really late in the process, like it's 2 months out, and all of a sudden, there's a huge strategy change. How do you mitigate against this? And essentially, like, is it just going back to the start, rerunning all your modeling? Are you just, running around like crazy trying to get this done? Or is there ways that you can plan ahead for those kind of major changes?
Go ahead, Marina. I saw you come off mute. Go ahead.
So I think I would say this is why I think when Melissa says start that planning process early, it is to try to, kind of avoid those as much as possible. You can never fully avoid those, right? Because, a COVID will drop in your lap, some sort of massive seismic shift in the market, can land. But what I would say is that hold your leaders accountable, hold yourself accountable for building really strong relationships with the executive team early so that you run into those as little as possible. And I think one thing that I find effective in having those types of conversations is candidly, if you lead with arguments like, oh, this is going to be really annoying to implement, painful, it's like that doesn't really land with the executive audience. But if you lead with a message that is like, hey, this is the revenue that you put at risk because, kind of this is what we've historically seen of like, it takes us this long to define exactly where the headcount go, and then it takes us, this long to have TA mobilized, and then, whatever, quantify it, right? Show the business impact of making decisions late in the game so that your leaders start to understand, hey, yes, they may sometimes still need to do that, right? That it may be as owners of the business the best thing to do, but make sure that they understand the consequences from a business outcome standpoint of making those decisions. And then I think if you get to that place, I think then I think you have to go back to your calendar and your kind of core modules of planning work and say, okay, let's have this joint conversation on what is the 80-20 version of each of these things. Where are we willing or not willing to introduce risk into things? And what does that mean in terms of critical path to get to a plan that is launched by, kind of X date? I think I've been in businesses where the answer has been like, you know what, we are willing to do a bridge for month one of the quarter, and we'll only launch plans in February, right? Sometime in February, right? I've been in businesses where no, that wasn't acceptable. And so you de-scope certain things, right? I think either of those can be, kind of options. But I think it's so much of this is about communication and openness with your leadership team on what's possible.
I so agree, Marina. The only thing I would add on top of that is So first off, know your audience, expect this to happen, because it will always. So to help mitigate or plan for that, I think trade-offs are your best friend. Because you need to be able to operate with agility. You don't know where the ask is coming from. It may not be a difficult C-suite leader. It might actually be the board of your company pushing things down on them too. So taking a bit more of a people first approach. You don't know where this has come from. So I completely agree. Don't go in saying this is really frustrating or taking it personally. It's still an objective task that we have to complete. So now it becomes about trade-offs and giving them the options to pick between. So for instance, if they want to move at the 11th hour in a completely different direction for your compensation plans, but you know that it takes 2 months for you to configure a new compensation plan, the trade-off is you can continue with the plan that we've aligned on until now, or we can go back to last year's plan. And these are the reasons why that those are the two options, and you tell me where you want to go. And I think that's the way I've helped kind of continue to stay on the timeline and hit the milestones, but operate with a bit of agility when those things do come left field. And the last thing I would just add to this too is to give them those milestones as advanced or as far ahead as possible. So if you know that you have time constraints, a work back plan is your very best tool to use, even at that level, to say, hey, when you have an impact to a compensation plan, just recognize it's 3 months if it's a transformational impact. And by transformational, here is what I mean. It would need to change metrics, not weightings, as an example, hypothetically. Really be very objective and give them discrete definitions about the types of change that lead to a type of implementation timeline that they need to be aware of. And they will then help you hit that milestone and give you the information on time. And it won't be a surprise when you can't action what they give you if it's last minute, because you've already had that alignment up front.
In the time we have left, we have a few minutes left, and this is a big topic, but maybe I'll ask you to try and keep it brief as possible. Again, big topic. I want to focus on AI and how the three of you see it shaping the future and impacting the sales planning process. Maybe I can start with yourself, Akira.
Sounds good. In terms of AI and automation and planning, I'd say in this first wave of AI deployment and go-to-market, we're seeing a lot more AI focus on processes that are run processes. For example, day-to-day tasks that can be automated by an agent. I think that's where most of the focus is right now. I think we will soon start to see a lot more AI-driven planning applications. I'll share two examples here at LinkedIn of things that are AI and automation driven for planning that are already up and running. And the first one is book of business optimization. So we've built an AMP optimizer to balance territories. So sales ops enter prompts such as, I want to minimize account movement, I want to balance total renewal value, I want to spread out renewal dates. The tool starts from the account universe and creates books of business optimized for the criteria that the user prompted. And the other example is we have what I call net ratio model, which is a model used to build quotas at the account level. We have a sales AI team that built this model to predict renewal performance based on multiple inputs, both in terms of B2B signals, such as product utilization, but also looking at signals from those accounts coming from LinkedIn, such as number of hires. But like I said, there's an area where we'd like to do much more, and I expect that in a year, there will be a lot more applications on this space.
Any thoughts from you, Marina or Melissa, before we round up? Again, no, I know it's a big topic. Just how is AI going to impact?
Yeah, it is a big one. First of all, I'll say, look, I think planning is art and science, and so I don't think planning will be replaced by AI, but it can certainly compress the timelines. I think Akira gave some great examples there. I think two ways that I've seen it immediately impact is, and it depends on the type of AI, like Gen AI, triaging escalation when you launch new plans or when you start a new year and you've got segmentation changes. We actually had in Slack or whatever tool that you might have the ability for reps to say, I don't understand this, can you help me? And it pulled down from FAQs we'd drafted and give them an immediate real-time response. And that was leveraging the LLM and our version of ChatGPT that we had internally. So I think that's one really easy way that we're starting to use Gen AI. Traditional kind of AI models or machine learning, predictive analytics, I think the biggest win in planning and thinking a little bit about compressing those timelines is around simulations or scenario planning to give you as many angles, paths to success as quickly as possible. And before that would take us each hours in Excel to get those models ready. Now with some of these scenario planning capabilities that folks are starting to offer, you can start to do that with a click of the button, and they can bring in actually benchmarks and external data and really help. And I think that's going to be a huge productivity save that AI will enable.
All right, well, we are at the top of the hour, so I wanted to thank the three of you for joining today and everyone in the audience for joining as well. I think that was a fantastic discussion. And just want to let everyone in the audience know as well that we have for the rest of the week some more sessions planned, so please tune in for those as well. But Marina, Kira, and Melissa, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And have a great rest of the day to everyone.